You're listening to When the Lies Began.
And today, well, we're taking a real deep dive into a case that I think many people remember vividly. It's one of the most uh, truly shocking and just heartbreaking criminal hoaxes in American history. The case of Susan Smith.
Yeah, it really is. This is the story of those 9 days back in October 1994. 9 days that just gripped the entire country. Everyone hoping, praying, only for all that hope to be completely shattered by, well, an unthinkable betrayal.
Absolutely. Our mission today is really to unpack this whole narrative piece by piece. We want to walk you through it chronologically.
Right. So we'll start with that initial immediate shockwave that went out from Union, South Carolina when she first made the claim.
Exactly. Then we'll move into that tense period, the investigation, where law enforcement and honestly the public too started realizing, wait a minute, something's not right here. We're being manipulated.
And finally, we'll look at the aftermath, the awful truth, the trial, and the long-term consequences that are still being felt, especially with her recent parole hearing 30 years later.
So let's set the scene. It's the evening of October 25th, 1994. Union, South Carolina, a small textile town. Pretty quiet usually. Suddenly, it's thrust into the national spotlight.
And that's because Susan Smith, who is just 23 at the time, a young mother, she contacts the police. She claims she's been the victim of a random, absolutely terrifying crime, FIS-CT.
And the story she told, it was devastatingly simple on the surface, FIS-CT. She said she was stopped at an intersection, and a black man jumped into her car, carjacked her burgundy 1990 Mazda Protege.
But the detail that just stopped everyone in their tracks, the reason the whole world started watching. Her two little boys were still in the back seats. Michael, he was 3 years old, and little Alex, just 14 months, strapped in their car seats, gone, taken by this stranger.
The reaction nationally was instantaneous. It was explosive. I mean, this wasn't just some local missing persons case anymore. This tapped into every parent's deepest fear, didn't it?
Oh, completely. The fear of the random, violent stranger snatching your children, it's the ultimate nightmare.
So immediately, a massive manhunt kicks off. It spans the entire nation, dominates the news cycles for 9 straight days, headlines, evening news, everything.
You saw candlelight vigils popping up all over the country. People were just desperate for these little boys to be found safe.
And right in the middle of this media frenzy, you have David Smith, the boy's father. He and Susan were estranged at the time, but he's standing right there next to her on television.
Yeah, I remember those images so clearly. They were pleading, publicly begging for the children to be returned safely.
And the thing that's just staggering looking back is David Smith telling the cameras, telling the world that he believed his wife 100% fact. Complete trust, even as she was carrying out this elaborate deception. The world watched them grieve together.
Okay, so to really get a handle on what was driving this terrible lie, we need to peel back that image of the grieving mother, don't we? We need to look at the reality of her life at that time, facty.
Exactly. Susan and David, they met young. They both worked at the local Winn-Dixie supermarket. Got married back in 1991. She was only 19, he was 20.
So young.
Very young. And they started their family pretty quickly. Michael was born, then Alex came along.
But it wasn't a happy picture for long, was it? Our sources show that by the spring of '94, just a few months before this happened, their marriage was basically falling apart.
Yeah, it was actively dissolving, factee. There had been infidelity, affairs admitted on both sides, and they'd separated.
And it seems Susan was already looking for an escape route, a way to build a new future for herself. And she thought she'd found it, or rather, who she thought could give it to her.
That's right. It hinged on a man named Tom Findley, factee. Susan was working as a secretary, not making much money, maybe $17,000 a year, at Conso, a local textile company.
And the company was owned by J. Carey Finley.
Correct. And Susan was having a pretty intense affair with the owner's son, Tom Findley, who was wealthy, well-connected. He represented everything her current life wasn't. Stability, maybe excitement, definitely a different financial status.
And this affair, this relationship, seems to be right at the heart of the motive, the incredibly selfish reason behind this whole tragedy fact theory.
It really does. Because Tom Findley broke off the relationship, and the reason he gave, based on, letters and later testimony, was brutal.
Yeah, what was it exactly?
He explicitly told her he was not ready for children, and that he didn't want the responsibility of your children. Fact, it wasn't about her personally. It was about the fact that she came with baggage, her 2 little boys.
Wow. So she's being rejected specifically because she's a mother.
Precisely. And that rejection, that specific reason, became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, led by Tommy Pope theory.
What was Pope's argument?
Pope argued this wasn't some spontaneous act of despair. It was calculated. He believed she saw Michael and Alex as the obstacle standing between her and the life she wanted with Findlay.
Okay, so the thinking was, if she just, say, gave the kids to David or abandoned them somewhere, she'd be seen as a bad mother, right? Which would ruin her image, maybe push Finley further away.
Exactly, theory. But if she could craft this story, this narrative where some violent stranger rips them away from her.
Then she instantly becomes the tragic figure,
Right.
the victim.
Right, the sympathetic victim of a terrible fate.
Yeah.
And that sympathy, that victim status, maybe, just maybe, she thought that would bring Tom Findlay back to her side now that she was tragically free of her responsibility.
So it was a trade, essentially. In her mind, possibly, her children's lives exchanged for a chance at this relationship, this different life.
That was the prosecution's argument, yes.
Yeah.
A horrific calculation. And to make that stick, she needed a story. A detailed, believable story, fact's sake.
And she provided one. She claimed this carjacker got in at the intersection, forced her to drive for about 4 miles, holding a gun on her the whole time.
Yeah, and the detail about asking for the children. Chilling. She claims she begged to take Michael and Alex with her, but the man supposedly just said he didn't have time for that. Cold. Indifferent.
And then, according to her story, he just abandons her near John D. Long Lake, just leaves her there a few hundred yards away.
Right. And from there, she runs to the nearest house, Shirley MacLeod's place, and sounds the alarm.
Yeah.
Patsy T. It was a performance designed for maximum impact terror, randomness, maternal anguish.
But there's another layer to this fabrication, one that had immediate and really toxic consequences. The racial element, FESCT.
Yes. Her description of this fictional attacker was incredibly generic. A black man wearing a toboggan hat. That's it.
And you have to think about the context. Union, South Carolina, 1994. That kind of accusation, so vague, it just poured fuel on existing racial tensions, didn't it?
Immediately. It caused chaos, FAT. Law enforcement poured enormous resources into chasing this fictitious man, this phantom. But worse, much worse, countless innocent black men in Union and the surrounding areas who vaguely fit that description. They were stopped, harassed, pulled over, questioned. Not just by police, but sometimes by scared or angry community members acting like vigilantes.
So her lie wasn't just about her and her kids. It actively harmed and terrified a whole segment of the community.
Absolutely. And that damage, that mistrust and outrage in the local African-American community, it didn't just vanish when the truth finally came out 9 days later. It lingered, all stemming from one person's self-serving lie to evoke pity.
So the search is on. It's massive. You've got the local sheriff, Howard Wells, the FBI involved with Agent Pete Logan, the State Law Enforcement Division, SLED, with Chief Robert Stewart. They're throwing everything at it.
They really were, leaving no stone unturned. But as the days ticked by, day 3, day 4, day 5, the story just wasn't adding up. Little things weren't fitting.
And by day 6, the investigators, Wells, Logan, Stewart, they privately reached a consensus, didn't they? A really chilling conclusion, FCT.
They did. After exhausting leads, checking alibis, going over her story again and again, they concluded the carjacker simply didn't exist. Susan Smith was lying.
That must have been a huge turning point, so the focus shifts completely.
Entirely. It's no longer about finding a carjacker or even the car, initially. It's about breaking Susan Smith's story. The investigation turns inward, onto her. The goal now is interrogation, getting her to confess.
And they decided on a specific strategy for that, right? Not just hammering her with questions.
No, they went for a psychological approach. The classic good cop routine, really fact. They needed her trust. They wanted her to see them as allies, people trying to help her through this ordeal.
And FBI agent Pete Logan played a big role in this, I understand.
He was central factee. He apparently spent something like 24 hours straight with her at one point, questioning her, talking to her. But not aggressively. He positioned himself, it seems, as this patient, almost fatherly figure, just trying to help this poor, distressed mother recall crucial details that could find her boys.
That kind of sustained, empathetic approach, it probably allowed those inconsistencies, the cracks in her story, to really show.
Exactly. Both the technical inconsistencies and the behavioral ones. Let's talk about the technical stuff first, the little details that just didn't work, FCT.
Okay, like the intersection story.
Right. Initially, she claimed the carjacking happened at a specific spot. The Monarch Mills intersection red light.
And Sheriff Wells knew the town like the back of his hand.
He did. And he immediately thought, hang on. That intersection had pressure plates, FCT, you know, the kind that detect a car's weight to trigger the light change.
Right, so if she was stopped there alone, Waiting.
The light wouldn't likely turn red unless another car pulled up or she'd been sitting there for an unusually long time, which would also be suspicious. The whole scenario she described, just sitting there, a guy jumps in, unnoticed, it felt staged.
Yeah.
It didn't fit the mechanics of the intersection or typical traffic patterns at that time.
So when they pointed this out, what did she do?
She changed her story. Figacci? She revised it. Okay, not Monarch Mills, she said. It happened at the Carlisle intersection instead.
But Wells was ready for that too, wasn't he? This is where they used a bit of strategic deception themselves.
Major bluff, yeah, Figacci. Wells testified later that he looked her right in the eye and told her, essentially, we had undercover officers at the Carlisle intersection that night, part of a drug sting operation, completely made up, of course. And, Wells continued, those officers saw everything. They saw your car. They saw you. And they saw nothing like what you described.
That's a huge gamble. He's basically telling her, we have eyewitnesses proving you're lying about this new location too.
It was a calculated risk to corner her, to make her believe her revised story was already blown. They were tightening the net, showing her they knew it was fabricated.
Okay, so those are the technical holes, but then there were the behavioral things, right? How she was acting, fact.
Oh, definitely. And this might have been even more damning to the investigators. They described her whole demeanor during questioning as just awkward, off. Not what you'd expect from a mother whose children have vanished.
What specifically stood out?
The lack of genuine grief, for one. One investigator described her quite bluntly as trying to force herself to cry. In fact, others noted she'd be sobbing, making sobbing noises, but there were no actual tears.
That phrase, scrunch crying, came up, didn't it?
It did, fact. That physical contortion of the face, trying to look distressed, but without the real emotion behind it. To experienced officers, that screams performance. It felt manufactured.
And this disconnect wasn't just during formal questioning, right? There was that raw footage.
Yes, the unedited footage from before a TV interview.
Yeah.
It's quite jarring. You see David Smith next to her, just completely shell-shocked, visibly falling apart. And Susan, she's seen almost, well, the description used was almost giggling. Fact. Telling him, we're going to be okay.
Giggling while her husband is crumbling and her kids are missing. That's deeply disturbing.
It shows such an incredible emotional dissonance, a complete lack of empathy for his pain, or maybe just a total inability to grasp the gravity of the situation she herself had created.
And her focus seemed entirely misplaced, too. There was that incident with Agent Logan asking about a wish.
Right. A really human moment from Logan trying to connect. He asked her during the peak of this massive search, if you could have one wish right now, what would it be? Fact.
You'd think the answer would be obvious. Bring my boys home.
Anyone would think that. But Susan's wish, she wished she had never told Tom Finley about her affair with his father, J. Carey Finley.
Wait, what? Her biggest concern, her one wish in the middle of all this, was about the romantic drama and the fallout from her affairs.
That's what she said. Fact-T. Think about that. Her children are missing, possibly dead. The whole country is watching, and her priority is managing the complications of her love life. It speaks volumes about where her focus truly lay.
And wasn't there also something about her interacting with the officers?
Yeah, adding to the bizarre atmosphere, there were reports she was actually flirting with some of the male investigators, Fact-TT, complimenting one on his appearance, telling a cop he looked good for 44. Apparently acting like the interrogation room was some kind of casual get-together, like a pizza party, was how one person described it. Again, just this profound inability to read the room, to understand the seriousness of her situation, or maybe a desperate attempt to manipulate through charm. It certainly raised red flags about her psychological state, maybe pointing towards that dependent personality disorder the defense later highlighted, that need for external validation even then.
Yet, through all these inconsistencies, all these red flags the investigators were seeing, David Smith remained steadfast.
He did. Publicly, he kept saying he believed her 100% Fact-T. He seemed genuinely frustrated that the police were, in his view, wasting precious time questioning Susan instead of being out there searching for the non-existent carjacker.
That blind trust must have given her cover, allowed the performance to go on much longer than it might have otherwise.
You have to think so. His belief lent her credibility, at least initially in the public eye, and perhaps even bought her time with the investigators.
Okay, so we're at day 9, November 3rd, 1994. The pressure is immense. The investigators are convinced she's lying. What finally broke her? Fact-T.
It came down to Sheriff Howard Wells. He knew Susan, knew her family. He decided to try one more approach, a personal one. He met with her alone.
And he used that same good cop style, that sort of fatherly approach.
He did Fact-T, But this time, he combined it with direct confrontation. He laid out the bluff about the undercover officers at the Carlisle intersection. We know you weren't carjacked there.
But he added something else, didn't he? Something more moral.
Yes, and this seems to have been critical. He stopped focusing just on the inconsistencies in her story and confronted her directly about the harm her lie had caused. He specifically highlighted the fear and devastation her false accusation against the black man had inflicted on the local community faculty.
So shifting from your story doesn't add up to your lie hurt innocent people.
Exactly. That moral pressure, that confrontation with the real-world consequences of her fabrication, that seemed to be what finally cracked her composure.
What happened then?
She broke down. She asked Sheriff Wells to pray with her, and then she uttered those absolutely chilling words, "I am so ashamed." And then the confession. Her children were not all right. Fact, the thing we learned. The awful truth started pouring out.
And the truth wasn't a carjacking. It was something far worse, rooted in her own despair.
Initially, yes. She claimed it started with her own suicidal ideation. Her original plan, she said, was to drive onto Highway 49 and kill herself. Fact, Edie.
Okay, but how did the boys get involved in that plan?
This is the devastating pivot. She said she felt she couldn't leave them behind. She decided, in her words, to end all three of their lives together. She actually told Wells she believed Jesus would take better care of them than I could.
Fact.
That justification. Jesus would take better care of them. It sounds like a desperate rationalization for an unthinkable act.
It does, and it marks the shift from her own planned suicide to the deliberate murder of her children. She chose to save herself, ultimately, and sacrifice them, perhaps still driven by that desire for the freedom she thought Tom Finley wanted.
So how did she actually do it, the mechanics of it? It was horrifyingly deliberate, according to her confession, Fess-et. She drove the Mazda down to John D. Long Lake, to the boat ramp.
Okay.
She put the car in neutral, letting it start rolling slowly down the ramp towards the water. But she didn't just let it go immediately. This part is crucial. She said she pulled and released the parking brake repeatedly.
Pulled and released it how many times?
3 times Fact-et. 3 moments when the car paused, where she had a chance to stop, to reconsider. 3 moments of choice before the final act.
And then?
And then she made the final decision. She physically got out of the car, stood beside it, reached back inside, and released the parking brake one last time.
Sending the car, with Michael and Alex still strapped in their seats, into the lake.
Sending it plunging into the dark water, Fess-et. She stood on the bank and watched it go down.
Oh my God. The forensics later filled in some agonizing details about that, didn't they?
They did. Based on the car model, the angle, the water depth, investigators estimated how long it would have taken for that 1990 Mazda Protege to become completely submerged on it.
How long?
Approximately 6 minutes.
6 minutes.
6 minutes while the car filled with water. 6 minutes where those little boys were trapped. 6 minutes where she stood there on the bank watching it happen. 6 minutes where she could have changed her mind, run into the water, tried something.
But she didn't.
She didn't intervene. She let it happen.
So, based on this confession, the focus immediately shifts back to the lake.
Immediately. Divers were sent to John D. Long Lake. It wasn't easy. The water there is about 18 feet deep, and the visibility was terrible, maybe only 12 inches Fess-et. Treacherous conditions.
Did they find it right away?
The first dive team didn't locate it. But the second dive, they found it. The Mazda, upside down on the lake bed.
And the boys?
Tragically, yes. They recovered the bodies of Michael and Alex. They were exactly as she had left them, still strapped into their child restraint seats, Fess-et.
Just devastating. And the car itself held more evidence, didn't it? Confirming the motive.
It really did, Fess-et. Inside the submerged car, investigators found that key piece of evidence, Tom Finley's letter. The one where he broke things off because he didn't want the responsibility of your children.
Right there with them.
Right there. But there was something else found in the car, too. Something highly symbolic. David Smith's wedding gown and their wedding album.
His wedding gown.
In the car.
Sorry, her wedding gown from her marriage to David.
And the album.
Okay, her wedding gown and the album. What's the thinking there?
It strongly suggests she wasn't just trying to get rid of the children as obstacles. She was trying to symbolically dispose of her entire old life. The marriage, the responsibilities, the image of herself as a wife and mother. All of it rolled into the lake, along with the physical embodiment of that life, her sons. It points to a planned, symbolic erasure, an attempt to start completely fresh. So after the confession and the recovery, Susan Smith was indicted. The trial kicked off in Union in July 1995. It was a media circus, as you can imagine.
And the legal teams were pretty high profile, weren't they?
They were. The prosecution was headed by Tommy Pope, who was quite young then, only 32, but clearly very sharp and determined.
And the defense.
A very experienced team. David Bruck and Judith Clark, FTG. Clark especially was renowned as an expert in death penalty cases. This is the same Judith Clark who later defended Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, and got him life instead of execution. So Smith had top-tier defense focused on avoiding the death penalty.
Given her confession, the basic facts weren't really in dispute, right? She admitted she rolled the car into the lake.
Correct. Fact T. The trial wasn't about if she did it, but why. It all came down to her intent, her state of mind at that moment. The jury essentially had to decide between two completely different stories about who Susan Smith was and what drove her.
What was the prosecution's narrative?
Yeah.
Led by Pope.
Pure, calculated malice of fact CT. Pope painted her as entirely selfish. He argued she saw her children simply as impediments to her desired relationship with Tom Findlay and the lifestyle he represented.
His phrase was something like she was trying to kill her old life and start anew.
Exactly. He emphasized that this was a conscious choice, prioritizing a man over her own children's lives. And he pushed hard for the death penalty. His argument was that this crime, this betrayal of maternal trust, was just as heinous, just as deserving of death, as if a stranger, the fictional carjacker, or even the father had done it.
Okay, so that's the cold, calculated narrative. What was the defense's counter?
The defense, led by Bruck and Clark, argued for mitigation. They didn't excuse the act, but they framed it as the result of a complete psychological collapse, driven by a lifetime of trauma, Fexty.
They brought in a lot of background information, didn't they?
A huge amount. They detailed her father's suicide when she was just 6 years old, her own suicide attempt when she was only 13, and years of documented sexual molestation by her stepfather, Bev Russell, which later morphed into a very disturbing, dysfunctional pattern, sometimes consensual, cycling through her adolescence and adulthood, FXD.
So they were building a picture of someone deeply damaged long before this happened.
Precisely. Their key psychological expert was Dr. Seymour Halleck. He testified extensively SCT. He diagnosed her with severe recurrent major depressive disorder. But crucially, he also diagnosed her with dependent personality disorder.
Dependent personality disorder, what does that mean in this context?
According to Halleck, it meant she had an overwhelming fear of abandonment, an inability to function alone. Her entire sense of self was tied up in her relationships with others, particularly men. When those relationships failed or she felt rejected, it triggered deep despair and self-destructive behavior.
So the rejection by Tom Findlay combined with the collapsing marriage.
Halleck argued it pushed her over the edge. He testified about her frantic attempts to find connection in the weeks before the murders, engaging in, I think, 4 different sexual relationships in just 6 weeks. SCT. All, he argued, were desperate attempts to stave off that profound loneliness and fear of being alone.
So the defense framed the drowning not as a calculated move to get rid of obstacles, but as an act of utter despair and sadness.
Yes. They argued she was in a state of psychotic breakdown, a moment of insanity where she genuinely, delusionally believed she was sending her children to a better place, to Jesus, because she felt so incapable herself. Not malice, but profound mental illness and despair.
That's a heavy decision for a jury. Cold calculation versus complete mental collapse. How long did they deliberate?
Not long, actually. Considering the complexity, it was relatively quick. Just 2.5 hours, fact-CT.
And the verdict?
Guilty on 2 counts of murder. The facts were just too stark.
Okay, so guilty. Then comes the penalty phase. Life or death. Pope wanted death. What did the jury decide?
They voted against the death penalty, fact-CT. They sentenced her to life imprisonment, but with the possibility of parole after 30 years.
Why 30 years?
That was due to South Carolina law at the time of fact-CT. The crime happened before a 1996 change in sentencing laws. So under the old law, life didn't necessarily mean life without parole. It meant eligibility after 30 years.
Was there any insight into why the jury chose life over death, given how horrific the crime was?
There was. A juror later spoke about it, theory. They suggested the feeling was that death would actually be the easier way out for her. They believed forcing her to live every single day with the crushing weight, the shame, the memory, the remorse of what she did to Michael and Alex. That was the harder punishment. They wanted her to live with it.
Wow. Live with the remorse. That was the intent.
That seems to have been the jury's logic, yes.
And what about David Smith, the father? How did he navigate the trial and the aftermath?
It was obviously devastating for him. He testified very emotionally during the trial. He
Mm.
talked about his boys, his lost future. There were reports of him just collapsing into his own father's arms during a court recess, completely overcome.
Understandably.
But the aftermath was complex. He did later agree to co-write a book about his life with Susan, for which he was reportedly paid around $110,000 FXE. So there was a degree of commercialization of the tragedy, which some people found difficult.
Right. And the car, the Mazda.
In the divorce settlement, David Smith actually received ownership of the car, the murder weapon, essentially FSET.
What did he do with it?
He had it destroyed immediately after the trial, crushed, obliterated, a symbolic act, perhaps, of trying to erase that physical reminder of the horror.
Fast forward 30 years, November 2024. Susan Smith, now 53 years old, becomes eligible for parole for the first time. XT. This brought the whole case right back into the spotlight.
It really did. It forced everyone, especially people in union, to revisit the trauma and confront the question of whether she had served enough time, whether she was truly remorseful, whether she should be released.
How did she present her case to the parole board?
She appeared via video link from Prison Fact. She did express remorse. She said she was very sorry, that she knew what she did was horrible.
Did she stick to the defense's narrative from the trial?
Pretty much, yes. She reiterated that claim of it being a moment of insanity, a point where she lost touch with reality. In fact, she portrayed herself not as a monster, but as someone who was deeply unwell at the time, consumed by depression.
But the decision wasn't just based on her words at the hearing, was it? Her behavior in prison over those 30 years played a big role.
A huge role. The prosecution came prepared with a detailed record of her time incarcerated, and it painted a picture that really undermined her claims of quiet remorse and rehabilitation faculty.
What kind of issues were raised?
A pattern of disciplinary problems. They mentioned past drug use within the prison faculty, incidents of self-mutilation, cutting herself, which, interestingly, can sometimes be associated with the kind of personality disorders, like borderline or dependent, that Dr. Hellick testified about, that need to feel something, perhaps, or a manifestation of distress.
Okay. What else?
And perhaps most significantly, sexual misconduct faculty.
Mm-hmm.
She apparently had inappropriate relationships, sexual encounters, with 2 different prison guards over the years. Both guards were investigated and subsequently fired because of it.
So not exactly keeping a low profile.
Not at all. And even more recently, prosecutors brought up reports that she'd been communicating extensively with a documentary filmmaker working on her case, and that she was receiving attention, letters, and even money from men outside prison men the prosecutor referred to quite bluntly as sugar daddies.
Sugar daddies. So still seeking that external male attention and validation even after 30 years inside.
That was certainly the implication the prosecution wanted the board to draw facts in T. They argued this whole pattern showed she remained continually focused on Susan, on her own needs and desires, rather than truly grappling with the impact of her actions on Michael and Alex.
Who spoke against her parole?
2 key figures from the original case, Tommy Pope, the prosecutor, who's now the Speaker Pro Tem of the South Carolina House, and David Smith, the boy's father, faculty.
What was Pope's argument?
Pope basically argued that her conduct in prison proved she hadn't achieved that level of genuine, crushing remorse that the jury had hoped for back in 1995 when they spared her life. He felt her actions showed she hadn't earned release.
And David Smith, his testimony must have been incredibly powerful.
Reports suggest it was deeply visceral and affecting facting. He stood firm, insisting this wasn't a mistake or an act of insanity. He called it a free choice that Susan made.
Did he talk about the ongoing impact on him?
He did. He spoke about the lasting emotional toll, the anxiety, the depression he still battles, and he shared a really harrowing recent experience.
What was that?
He'd recently taken scuba diving lessons. During a practice dive, something went wrong. He sank quickly under the weight of the gear, and he panicked. Couldn't immediately get back to the surface FCT.
Oh, wow.
And in that moment of panic, underwater, fighting for air, he said he vividly saw the faces of Michael and Alex. He told the parole board that terrifying incident was the closest he could ever imagine coming to understanding the absolute horror his boys must have felt in those final minutes in the submerging car.
That's just gut-wrenching, giving voice to their terror through his own experience.
It was incredibly powerful testimony, and he finished by vowing to be at every single one of her future parole hearings. He said he would be there to speak for Michael and Alex, to make sure the board understood the permanence of her choice, and to ensure, in his words, that their deaths didn't go in vain. Factsy.
So with that testimony and the record of her prison conduct, what was the outcome?
The parole board denied her parole. Unanimously, Fassy T.
Unanimous. When is she eligible again?
She can apply again in 2 years. In 2026, Fassy T. #outrage.
So when we step back and look at this whole case from beginning to end, it really is a profound, dark study in betrayal, isn't it?
It really is. It starts with that immediate, incredibly cruel lie, the racial hoax. A lie that wasn't just a cover story, but one that actively endangered and terrified innocent people in her community and wasted huge amounts of police time.
And it culminates in the most fundamental betrayal imaginable. A mother betraying the absolute trust of her children, choosing her own perceived path forward over their very lives.
Yeah, and the case leaves us wrestling with these two starkly different pictures of Susan Smith, doesn't it? On one hand, you have the prosecution's evidence, the Findlay letter, the wedding dress in the car, the calculation needed to stage the scene and maintain the lie for 9 days. It paints her as manipulative, selfish, seeing her kids as obstacles.
But then you have the defense's narrative, backed by psychological testimony, a picture of someone deeply broken by trauma, the suicide, the abuse, the depression, the personality disorder, someone who, in their view, snapped under pressure and committed an act born of despair, not malice.
Right. And what really stands out, I think, is thinking about that jury's decision back in '95. They chose life. They explicitly hoped, it seems, that she would live with remorse. That was meant to be the punishment.
Which brings us to the really difficult question, especially after the parole hearing. If someone commits an act this horrific, even if it's potentially rooted in deep trauma and mental illness, and if their behavior over decades in prison suggests, as the prosecution argued, a continued focus on self, on manipulation, on seeking attention, can incarceration ever truly fix whatever is broken inside?
That's the crux of it, isn't it? When the sentence is life, not death, what does accountability look like long-term? What constitutes genuine remorse versus just saying the right words? What level of transformation, if any, is possible or even required to balance the scales after a tragedy like this?
These aren't easy questions, and they're questions that won't go away. Susan Smith's next parole hearing is just around the corner, relatively speaking, in 2026.
And it will force us all, once again, to confront the legacy of this case and what justice truly means in the face of such an incomprehensible loss.